morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Vance. I'm the Senior Loss Control Representative at Insurance Board. Today, we have a gracious panel of guests who are all willing to share with us how they navigated COVID-19 protocols and recommendations by the Centers for Disease Control and the American Camp Association in 2020. Additionally, they will be speaking about how they are planning to incorporate or adjust based on the recommendations in the American Camp Association's Field Guide for 2021. Please welcome David Box. David is the
Hello.
Associate Director at Luther Dale Ministries. Bree Payne. Bree is the Executive Director at John Knox Center. And Emily Hooker, who is the Associate Director at Ferncliff. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. The format for today's video will be somewhat informal. We hope to have each of our presenters discuss best practices in 9 essential categories of outdoor ministries amidst COVID-19. Those categories are communication, drop-off and pickup and daily procedures, activities, disinfecting and PPE, transportation, worship, food service, expectations and rules for things like lodging, hand washing, cohorts, masks, screenings and health assessments, and vaccines. We are asking each guest to discuss how they apply the practices within their ministries. We have broken down the categories by presenter, but of course, if anyone has anything additional to add, we hope they share how they navigated any specific challenges. In this format, we hope to provide you various perspectives on how you can best guide your team this summer. With all of that said, and before we begin, I would just like to say the information provided reflects the best available information at this time. It is possible that the recommendations and protocols may change as the unique challenges that COVID-19 poses changes as well. Information and recommendations shared should not be considered firm, nor are they intended to displace professional informed judgment based on observed conditions and situations. The discussions are practices that have worked within the ministries who are presenting them and have been formed from publicly available sources, as well as based on the knowledge and expertise of the subject matter experts within their ministries. So let's get started. The CDC does have a camp decision tool on their website to help you make the best decision for your organization. It's prioritized into 3 parts. Part 1 is, should you consider opening? Part 2 are the recommended health and safety actions in place. And part 3 is ongoing monitoring in place. We encourage you, if you are still undecided, to visit the site and complete the steps to determine if your operation and program can meet the expectations of the CDC. And now that you have done that and you've decided to open and you are planning, David, can you talk to us about what you found key to communicate to parents leading up to and during camp?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The first thing that I want to say to everybody is this is going to be hard, but at camp, we know how to do hard things. That's what we do, and we know how to figure it out. And so know that you're not alone. There are a ton of resources out there and available. As far as communicating to parents, the biggest thing that I would say is to over-communicate. Over-communicate, communicate again, and when you think that you've done it enough, go ahead and do it one more time. We last summer, in the midst of all the unknown that we still had about COVID-19, we tried to do everything we could to make sure that the parents got that information and that information was available. We made pages on our website specific to COVID-19 and our protocols. We sent out emails more so than we had in any other summer. We made a video talking through and showing what our protocols were going to be. And don't assume that people are going to read. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily happen. So you have to be extra You have to really, really push it on them and make sure that they're going to see the information. So one example of that, last summer, we decided that we were going to require a 14-day temperature check before campers came to camp. That was one of the protocols that we had put into place. And we wanted them to fill out this form. We sent an email 2 weeks beforehand to remind them to do it, 1 week beforehand to make sure they were doing it. And we still had parents coming to camp without the form filled out. And unfortunately, we had to turn campers away because we had said this was going to be one of the protocols. So, and we needed to stick to it and not make the decision that this camper could come anyway. So if you're going to have that, I've always said, if you're going to put your foot down, you better like where you're standing. So if you're going to have a protocol like that, you need to make sure that it is over communicated in any way possible. The other thing that we did as far as drop off and pickup, it was very different. We did a drive-through drop-off procedure. So parents stayed in the cars. We asked that they only brought one parent, if possible, and not the whole family. And we went through the whole time. The first stop was a temperature check, and then we talked to the healthcare person, got any forms that still needed to be turned in. We unloaded the luggage, and then the parents said goodbye. They were able to get out of the car for a minute and give a hug and those kind of things, but then on you go. And we also spaced out our registration process much further so that we only had 10 or 20 people trying to check in a given 30-minute time slot. And that seemed to work well. And a lot of our parents actually really appreciate it. And they asked us if we were going to do the drive-through check-in again. They appreciated not having to stand in lines like they did in previous years at registration. So that was interesting. We also asked, again, last summer, a lot of what we were hearing about was touch points and disinfecting touch points, and now we know a little bit more about that. But we asked campers to bring their stuff to pack in a large plastic tote, and then those totes were disinfected and wiped down before they made it to the cabins. But we didn't let the parents walk to the cabins and settle the campers in as we had in years past. And as far as end of the week end of the week pickup goes, we kind of did the same thing. Parents stayed in their cars. We brought their luggage to the cars and then said goodbye after our time at camp.
Question, do you think it required more or less staffing doing it that way versus a traditional process?
I think it actually required a little less staffing because we didn't have as many tables at registration, and we kind of spaced that out. And then all of our support staff were in charge of taking the luggage out of the cars and cleaning that, and the cabin leaders could just get their kiddos and then start the camp program. So it was actually one of those kind of happy coincidences that made it work.
Thank you, David. Bree, Emily, anything that you can think to add that you might have done a little differently or taken to a different level?
I would just say that we did something that sounds almost exactly the same. And as he pointed out, as stressed out as we were about the first day of check-in or the first day of check-out and, hey, this is a new procedure, we will never go back. Our parents loved it. We received tons of feedback about the efficiency and the one-on-one at each step. You didn't have anyone interrupting that process. When you were at a table, some child could run over and talk to you, or another parent might try to be getting some attention from you. But in this case, when that car drives up, you are one-on-one with that person. And it actually ended up being more hospitable. And that was kind of a shock for us because we felt like, oh gosh, parents are going to really miss going to the cabins, or parents are going to really not like that as much. And that was not what we found at all. We found that they were very happy with this process, and it was much more efficient, and it was just as hospitable because they did get that one-on-one time with each station, whereas they might not have had that in our other method.
Thank you. Thank you, Bree. That's great. Emily, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think I was in a slightly different boat than my colleagues here in that we didn't run overnight camp programs last summer. We took the guidance from the CDC and from our state, and we determined that we would feel safer running day camp programs at a limited capacity last summer. But several of our procedures were very similar in that we had staggered drop-off and pickup times. Parents stayed in their cars for the entirety of it. We did daily health checks with our staff and our campers. Each group was had an independent schedule and a rotation through the activities where they were not doing any activities with any other group. We emphasized wearing masks and social distancing, staying outside as much as possible, separate spaces for each group. If they had to go indoors, each group had their own separate location. So I think we had some fairly similar procedures in our day-to-day operations.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, I found interesting when I read the ACA field guide, I saw that they discuss a lot of things in terms of good, better, best practices, specifically in regards to activities. Like each activity had a recommended practice level as to what was good, better, or best, and what your facility, your ministry may be able to do and may not be able to do based on your capacity. So, David, what can you tell us about what you found successful managing the activities and how you might be pivoting this summer and doing things differently?
Sure. So last summer we ran at a very reduced capacity. We decided that 40 campers at a time is what we were going to stick with, and we ran actually shorter program sessions. So typically our camp is a week long. We ran only 3 nights, and we did that because if someone were to get to have a sickness or some symptoms, it would give less time to spread that, I guess, amongst the other campers. This summer, we are planning to do full week-long sessions. So that's going to be a pivot for us. In that half-week session, we scheduled it out very clearly. And so each cabin group or pod had a specific rotation that they would do for that session, and that the cabin leaders knew this was my schedule for the week, when I was going to the waterfront, when I was going down to the ropes course, things like that. This summer we're still going to do the pods. They're going to be a little bit bigger. We've decided to do 12 to 18, which is kind of two cabins together in a pod. But again, they'll do everything together. They won't mix or mingle with any of the other pods, so that if there is someone who is exhibiting symptoms and we do have to send a pod home, the rest of camp will have been separated from them. As far as the different activities, a lot of it was adding that hand washing. You washed your hands twice before you did any activity. You washed it before you left the previous activity, and then you washed your hands before you left when you got to the new activity area. And again, we made sure that we were moving folks around camp so that those pods could stay separated. If they did need to be within the same area, they were 6 feet apart, good social distancing. But once you were in your pod or your cabin, that was your household for the week. And then you could kind of do and act as though, like you would in your household at home. The biggest thing with activities is also thinking about how you're going to disinfect some of those areas and those touch points, and how you needed to. One of the biggest ones that we found was the ropes course. You can't really take a disinfectant and wipe down the ropes and the harnesses and things like that. And so we decided that time and sunlight were going to be our biggest friends in this. So we separated out our climbing harnesses into the different groups, and then we would actually hang them up and let them sit in the sun before a group came, and then leave them out in the sun until after the group came. And we tried to have enough groups so that each pod would have their own set of harnesses and not have to do that. Again, I don't know if that's going to be as necessary this summer with what we're learning about touch points, but that's just the kind of thing. You have to think about every single activity and how you're going to modify it to fit within the protocols that you decide are going to be the best for your camp.
Thank you. And Emily, since you mainly did day camp, there was probably a lot of activities going on all day. So what did you find that was maybe a little different than what David said?
Yeah, one thing that surprised us was that most of our camp activities we were able to do, some without really any modifications, some with some modifications, such as smaller groups there at a time, or fewer kids in a watercraft, for instance, or spread out a little bit more. But there were only a couple of activities where we really felt like there wasn't a safe way to do them. So that was a big surprise for us, and we were really pleased that we were able to offer sort of the breadth of our activity options for this past summer. One thing that we felt was a really useful tool was having our summer staff, as part of staff training, brainstorm through a typical day of all of the activities. What are the things I would need to keep in mind for this activity? Or what are some ways I can do this activity safer? Sort of that good, better, best spectrum. What are some ways that we can do this as safely as possible? Of course, when the permanent staff, my camp director and I had discussed those things prior to the staff arriving, but our summer staff had some really great ideas and some really good questions to consider as we looked through our schedule and looked at those activities about the safest way to do those things. Similarly, we are learning things about sanitizing spaces and what needs to be sanitized and what doesn't. Thinking back to last summer where we were sanitizing wooden picnic tables outside. I don't think we'll be doing that again, but I think it was sort of that vibe last summer where we wanted to make sure we were doing our due diligence and doing things as best as we could. Things that might seem a little silly now, like sanitizing an outdoor wooden picnic table.
Well, you were trying your best, right? I do have a question though. So you said that you didn't do everything last year. Are you doing everything this year? Are you full 100% this year?
In terms of activities?
Yes.
I think so. So one of the things we didn't do this past summer was our low ropes course, as so much of that involves touching and spotting and kids being very close to one another. That wasn't something we were going to do with our day campers. This summer, as we look ahead to overnight camp, which we are running this summer, we are hopeful that each small group, each pod, each family group will be acting as a family, and there are looser restrictions in terms of how they can interact with one another. And so things like the low ropes course can be done more easily when everyone is acting as a family group instead of having to distance.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bree, did you have anything to add about activities?
We were very similar in the sense of, yes, cleaning and sanitizing was part of it, but we used time and sunlight to our advantage as well. We kind of turned the entire typical day of camp into a game when we worked with staff, similar to what Emily just said about getting your staff on board and getting them part of the process, not imposing, I'm going to say, the rules of COVID, but helping them learn to think what is an okay situation and what is not an okay situation. So for example, we would say, okay, groups can't pass each other within 6 feet, because one of the things we wanted was to not have to wear masks overnight. And that required our pods to stay very independently as those households together. They could be close together, but they could not come in close contact with anyone else. And so we thought about the geography of our site and how could we have a rotation. We sort of have I'm going to say a mountain in the middle and a circle around the outside, kind of like a donut. And we always said we're going to move in a clockwise rotation around camp. And that prevented us from having a group that was coming to an activity run straight on into a group that was leaving the activity. And so that kind of thinking through that geography of how can you kind of prevent those situations where there's going to be that temptation for one kid to run up and hug someone from another pod. I mean, obviously we communicated this with kids, we communicated it with parents, but even thinking so far as saying, let's think of the geography of camp and how can we use the scheduling and the time in between. But also we don't want to create the position where kids are running head on into each other and making it difficult or awkward to maintain that 6 feet of social distance. And so we kind of made it like a game. And so we walked through it with our staff, like how would we move one group from ropes to the waterfront or from this place? And we decided that looking at clockwise rotations or enter and exit locations really helped us make it more fluid and less awkward when you're trying to say, oh, I can't touch you, I can't get near you, because we're summer camp. We're all about relationships. We're all about appropriate touch. We're all about high-fiving people as we go by, and we just couldn't do that. And so by doing that geography kind of moving, and it just really helped with efficiency and flow.
I think that's great insight, because that's probably not something that most people are thinking about. They're probably thinking about the activity itself, but not the comings in between the activities. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. We kind of talked a little bit about cleaning and disinfecting, and the ACA does talk specifically again about good, better, best practices regarding that. So David, why don't you talk a little bit more about not cleaning wooden tables this summer, but what you are doing for disinfecting and cleaning?
Sure. We talked with our food, our service that we order our chemicals, cleaning chemicals from, and ordered these buckets basically that have disposable towels in them and something to add into that bucket. And it was a Dixie brand. And so it became kind of a thing where every cabin, every pod had their Dixie with them at all times. And the staff would wipe down any of those touch areas. So when a cabin is moving from one activity to the other and they need to stop at the bathroom in the dining hall, the cabin leader would say, everybody wait for a second, and I'm going to go hit all the doorknobs and light switches with the Dixie, boom, 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 all the way in. And then everybody would use the restroom, wash their hands, and then come out. So you had the staff had their Dixie with them at all times. And we even instituted that in staff training of we need to have our Dixie. The big thing was water jugs. We'd always just put water jugs around camp, and like, how do you do that? And can you? And that's another touch point. And then adding more time for the daily cabin cleaning and disinfecting. We've always had cabin cleaning time, but now it took on another step when you have to think about it and hit all of those touch points and things like that for those campers. And that was the biggest thing. And then we had our support staff cleaning those common areas and those high traffic areas daily in the dining hall, in the camp store, canteen. So really pushing through that. And you really just have to sit and think, like, where do we have to go? And I think this summer, it's really about following those guidelines that are constantly being updated. And that was the biggest message on our website is we will continue to monitor the situation as it changes. So will we. And a big piece of that was with mask. So last summer, our staff wore masks at check-in and drop-off day when they would be exposed to the public. The campers were encouraged or told they could bring a mask if they wanted, but once they got into their pod, they wouldn't have to wear their mask indoors and things like that. And then right before our last week of summer camp last year, Wisconsin set out a mask mandate. And so immediately we had to switch and change and go, okay, what does that mean? Because we're going to now have to be wearing masks anytime that we're indoors, unless we're sleeping or brushing our teeth or showering, those kind of things. And so staying on top of it. And what we've learned from the ACA and their guidebook is that masks are the most effective non-pharmaceutical intervention that you can use. And so for this summer, a big change is we're going to be wearing masks. Universal mask wearing is going to be required by staff and campers anytime that they're indoors and anytime that they're outdoors, and cannot distance more than 6 feet away unless they're swimming or eating or brushing their teeth. So we're encouraging campers to bring several masks with them so that they can rotate those out throughout the week and change them if they get wet or dirty or things like that. But that's just an example of constantly monitoring the situation, not being swayed necessarily by every different news story, but find your trusted sources. The ACA and the CDC are great at that, and then sticking with that, but being ready to change if needed. Right.
Yeah, I think that's when we think back at 2020 and probably 2021, pivot is the word that comes to mind. And it and you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. And it can literally change. Like you said, you had people in the middle of a 2-week camp and it changes in the middle of it. So you have to be able to pivot. And it sounds like you guys all did a great job last year. So thank you. I think transportation-wise, Bree, you were the only one who did some transportation last year, right? So what?
Right.
Let's pivot and talk about transportation for a minute, because I know that David and Emily don't have to worry about that, but some of our participants may. So why don't you tell us what worked for you last summer and what changes you may be making this summer?
So I just want to be really clear that when we talk about transportation and what our experience was, is that we transport campers on adventure trips. I know a lot of camps transport campers from a drop-off location, maybe in different cities, to the camp and back to the drop-off location before and after the camp begins and ends. We don't do that. And so I really can't speak to putting a ton of kids on a bus or anything like that. But what I can talk about is we were one of the few camps, I believe, to actually put kids on in a vehicle and drive off site. And we have done that in a lot of different ways in the past, as far as doing it with different camp sessions. We've done choice day activities where kids from different family groups would come together, get in a van, and go see a waterfall. We did not do that this summer. There was no way for us to kind of keep up with that good, better, best idea. The best is not to have anyone in a vehicle together that doesn't also share a sleeping space unless they're wearing masks. And if they are in a vehicle, they need to be distanced if they're not in the same pod. We could not do that. That was one of those activities that we said, here's what we do, here are the rules. We can't apply those rules to make this activity happen, no matter how creative we get. And so we just said, we're not going to do it except on our adventure trips. Our adventure trips are very small, under 14 children, and at most 3 staff people. They are together the entire length of the camp. So when they check in, it is the same group of children that share a sleeping space, that also go and camp together, that are in a van together, that go down a river or rappelling or rock climbing together. So it's that same pod concept, except going off site. There was no change for us between what we have done in the past with that particular camp session and what we did in 2020, because those kids were their own pod. So when they got in the van together, that was no different than them sleeping in a cabin together for us. They did not wear masks except when in public. Anytime they were outside of our pod, our group together, we required them to wear masks. But when they were together in the vehicle itself, they were not required to wear masks, because to us that was no different. You weren't preventing anything different than when they slept in the same cabin together. And so we did transport children, but only off-site and only in their own pods. Those staff members as well were part of that pod. We did not interchange support staff. Our trip leader was with them, I'm going to say 24/7. That trip leader did not run off and go join another pod to do something else. When people were assigned to that group, they were with that group from the beginning to the end.
So that seems to be what's going to work, is that pod or cohort mentality, that worked and that will continue to work and apply over to many things, obviously, as we go forward, talking about food service and some of the other aspects of camp. It's going to apply there as well. So thank you for that on transportation. What about worship? What did you guys all do? And Bree, if you want to maybe speak first and lead us with how you handled worship last year and what you are planning on changing for this year.
Sure. Well, at our site, worship was one of the things that probably looked most recognizable to other summers than other activities. Because we don't have a chapel, we worship outdoors or in a open air pavilion space. So all we really needed to do was to keep those family groups and cohort groups together, and then space those groups far enough apart that singing was also possible. So I believe at that time, I'm not sure if it's changed, but at that time it was 25 feet between people who were not in the same family group singing. And so we lived and breathed different colors last year. Every cohort group, every family group had a color associated with them, and picnic tables were that color. Cleaning supplies had duct tape in that color wrapped around it. Coolers had pieces of duct tape on the top that showed what color could touch that specific surface. We used that same concept and moved it into worship. We put tarps, and we had different colors of tarps, and the worship, we knew where that they could put those tarps far enough apart so that we could put a tarp on the ground. The kids in that cohort knew that to show up at worship, they needed to go to the blue tarp or the green tarp and sit on that tarp. Those tarps were far enough apart that we could sing. And we made sure that the minister, chaplain, anyone reading scripture, anything like that, that we're going to be moving toward what you would think of as the front of the sanctuary, was 25 feet away from the closest cohort group in front of them. So we kind of thought about that and just took everything we normally did and spaced it way out.
Gotcha. Emily and David, did you find similarly?
Yeah, we for day camp, we do small group Bible study as our worship time, and we continued that last summer. We usually do a morning celebration where all of the groups are together and they do a sort of intro to the day's lesson that goes into their small group Bible study. We didn't do that this past summer. This summer, as we have overnight and day camp groups, we are still planning on having small group Bible study where they are in their small family pod and they do Bible study together. We're also anticipating for overnight campers that they do evening worship, a Vespers kind of ceremony around a campfire in their small pod as well. We haven't worked out the details quite yet, but we would like to do sort of a special Vespers on the last night of camp, very similar to how Bree described at John Knox, where we are in a big open space where each pod can kind of sit together, but be separated from one another and have an outdoor, safely distanced worship with everyone together. I think our daily routine, though, will be mostly small group Bible studies and Vespers.
Gotcha.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about you?
Yeah, we did similar. So last summer, with only 40 as our max number, we did gather for daily worships as we had in years past, but again, outdoors and spaced out. This summer, we decided, in speaking with our board and looking at the different suggestions, that we're going to operate at 70% capacity. What that means for us is 96 campers. And so we've decided that daily worships may not be the best idea, even if we are spaced out. So we are going to do one all camp worship at the beginning of the week and one on the last night. But the rest of the worships, we're moving to a small group ministry. So they'll have small group Bible studies. And then we had typically done a morning devotion and an evening devotion as your cabin. And so we're going to encourage the staff to kind of buff those up a little bit and become more of a worship as opposed to just a devotion each day. So we'll have an alpha worship as a cabin and an omega worship as a cabin each day.
So it sounds like worship is not necessarily going to be the biggest challenge for you all. No.
One thing I will say that we learned, it is typical for us in our culture to invite parents to the final worship for the session. And coming to our final Vesper service has always been kind of like a closing for us. Obviously, parents couldn't come on site. So we did all of our final Vespers Facebook Live. Why it took a pandemic for us to learn that we should be doing that, I'm not sure. We needed to be doing that before, because grandma, grandpa, aunts, uncles now can join in. They can make comments when they see their child or grandchild. They may live in Wisconsin, but in Tennessee, they're getting to watch their grandchild read a liturgy on Facebook Live. And we will continue that practice. That worked really well for us. And it made it where even though parents couldn't be there, they were watching, and that was really great. But one of the things, if you do choose to do worship and spread folks out, that we learned the hard way was your poor chaplain will need some help with volume. And so what we did was we bought a headset, and we already owned an outdoor portable battery powered speaker, and we got a headset that integrated with that, because when you're spreading kids multiple pods, 7, 8 pods, 25 feet apart from each other, you're starting to look at a football field worth of worshipers that your poor chaplain and liturgist are going to have to scream to. And many times our worship services, in fact, most of the time, don't occur where there's power. And so we bought a headset that we could use, a couple of them actually, and we had that big outdoor speaker that we could connect to. And we learned that on the first session, and of course going on to Amazon really quick and getting something overnighted to us so that we had it for the next session. But that is just a little pro tip. If you plan to do that, also be thinking about volume, if especially you're going to do something like Facebook Live.
That's great. And isn't it funny how, like, I think you said this earlier, David, that some of the changes you made are things that you're not going to go back on because they are now working so well. And you are right on. I may not be able to be there, but grandmas, aunts, and uncles can all now participate, and that's the benefit. So kudos to you for thinking that through, and thank you for sharing that. One thing that I think might be a challenge is food service, from planning and preparation to serving and cleaning and disinfecting. How did you do it all, Bree? And what advice do you have for the people who are maybe just starting out for the first time this summer?
Take a deep breath and don't be too incredibly overwhelmed. Because it is very daunting when you read all of those standards, you read all those recommendations. It can be done. Sometimes it has to be done creatively. And sometimes you're just going to have to say, it's okay that we've not done it this way before. This is a new way. And that's okay. And you may discover that, hey, we kind of like this. One of the big things with food service for us, I will go back to the color coordinated everything. We staggered groups entry into our dining hall. We I think we did 10-minute spacing for every meal. It wasn't even a recommendation, it was a requirement at the time, was that we serve cafeteria style. And that was a health department requirement for us. That was new. That is not something we have normally done. We are typically either serving family style or buffet style. And to kind of switch gears in your brain and think this needs to be cafeteria style, that was a shift for us and a shift in thinking. But again, after the first week, it was just, this is what we do. And it wasn't that difficult. Some of the kinks needed to be worked out, but cafeteria style is a possibility. That prevented things like multiple people touching the same surfaces. Again, that was a big part of last summer. We aren't 100% sold on what we are going to do this summer as it comes to family style versus cafeteria style, because if the thing you're trying to prevent is people from outside pods touching the same surface, even family style could be done that way. A bowl being passed between the same people who sleep in the same cabin, but not being passed to a different cabin, could still work. So we haven't decided what we're going to do this summer as far as cafeteria versus family style. But last summer, it was 100% cafeteria style. Kids would line up. Typically, one of the things we missed was singing our prayers in the dining hall, singing inside, obviously, spaces. Everything was outdoors. They sang the prayer that they normally do in their own pod outside before they came in. So instead of having everybody at camp doing the same prayer at the same time, small groups did that, pods did that together. And so they would walk through the dining hall, get their food through a serving line that, of course, we were behind screens, just like you see in restaurants now. We were behind those big plexiglass screens. And then they would walk out the other side of our dining hall down to picnic tables that were color-coded with their pods' colors. They would pick up a box that had all of their silverware, any type of special thing that was, I'm going to say like a condiment that was required for everyone, like pancake syrup cups we didn't want every child to have to hold another thing as they're walking outdoors. So we just had small plastic boxes with handles that had everything that they might need for that meal. Ketchup, packets, salt, pepper packets, those all were in there, napkins, silverware, and that went to the table with that particular color. They also had a bus tub in the same way. And so they bussed their own table and brought it back into the dining hall when it was time to clean up. So it was really a walk through kind of think of a drive through, except a walk through our dining hall. We ate outside. I'm going to guess 97% of the meals served this summer were eaten outside. We thought that was going to be awful. We really thought that was not going to be fun. It ended up being quite okay. Again, once you've done this for a week, it becomes, oh, this is just how camp works now. And no one complained. It was not a hard thing. We would call for seconds, and we would call those seconds in the same order as they had come into the dining hall. So your first group got called for seconds, second group got called for seconds, just as they came in, and we cleaned up the same. So again, there was a flow through our dining hall. We talked about flow geographically. Well, flow through the building. Same thing. You didn't use the same door to go in and out. You went in one way, and that followed through our dining hall, whether you were picking up food, getting seconds, or dropping off bus tubs. All of that happened in the same direction through our dining hall. And so that was a key to our food service. We mentioned coolers. We always have water. Even if we have Kool-Aid or something, juice, we always have water available, and kids are always needing to fill up their water bottles around meals. And again, what we did was we bought a lot of coolers, and we put duct tape, colored duct tape on them that was their colors. And that is where they sat on their picnic tables, rain or shine. And then we would have our food service staff go down and wash those out and then refill them in between during the day. But one of the challenges we had is we didn't have enough support staff to run around and clean surfaces 24/7. If you really think about common area surfaces, and before you start changing things at your site, how many times that kid's thumb touches a different surface, whether it's hand washing station or a drink station. And so the way we did it is we said, okay, the thing we have to prevent is multiple pods touching the same surface. We just got to have more surfaces, and we have to know what they can and can't touch. So having to clean those fronts of those coolers, for example, or having to clean those boxes that had all their condiments and silverware in them wasn't something we needed to do, because it was only those people that were ever touching those. Now, we did wipe them down obviously once a day, but we weren't having to be crazy about every single time somebody's thumb touched it, there had to be a Clorox wipe right behind it. So think about what you're trying to prevent and how best you can do that.
Thank you. David, Emily, anything you want to add about food service?
Yeah, last year our chef did a fantastic job, and we did everything in boxes or bags for our food service. So they would go through the dining hall, and each camper would grab their box meal or their bag lunch, and then go eat outside. That was possible with 35 or 40 kids. It's not going to be possible. We're going to be moving to a cafeteria style again this summer, which is what we typically did. But for those camps who are running with smaller, much smaller things, that's an opportunity and our chef just did a great job and figured it out and was able to do that. So as she said, everything is possible, and tradition at camp is only about a week long. So once you get through it and once you try it, you can definitely do it.
Yeah, I'll say this is very helpful for me as we are planning our overnights for this summer. We're anticipating very similar things, but these are great tips and best practices that you all are sharing for us. We are anticipating a similar cafeteria style line, a staggered entry between groups sitting outside when possible, distanced from the other groups, things that are packaged just for that group, like silverware cups, etc. So that's very helpful for us. we this past summer with our day camp program, and then this summer with day campers, they will bring their own lunch and snacks. We had them eating outside, distant from one another, in their own area, and that worked out great. It worked out so well that we're doing it again this summer, and that will prevent us from having to serve campers and overnight campers through our cafeteria style line this summer.
Thank you. And Emily, while you're talking this, so this is your first season going into lodging. So talk to us a little bit about how you've set those expectations for lodging, hand washing, cohorts, pods, whatever you're calling it, masks, everything else. Like, you have unique challenges. I'm just curious what because you're doing this for the first time, what your process is looking like.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we are taking guidance from ACA, the CDC, the Department of Health in our state, and following those best practices that we've learned from our colleagues who have run programs, as well as what we've learned from day camp this past summer. We've also been running a preschool and a nature's outdoor virtual school for elementary age students this year. So we've really felt like we've had a handle on a lot of the typical things you would think of, like pods, not mixing groups, an independent schedule where the groups are rotating through activities, sanitizing spaces, wearing masks, distancing, all of those things that are sort of second nature to us now. I think David mentioned earlier, and I think this is really key, communicating ahead of time is so important. If you set those expectations with parents and campers and students ahead of time, it makes the transition a lot easier. So we have a dedicated page on our website that we update as we get more information from our state and guidance for running our summer camp programs. We post videos and FAQs. We post on social media, send numerous emails to parents about what our policies are, our expectations, what they and their children can expect. And I think an important thing that I might recommend would be in one of those emails, we mentioned a list of things for parents to discuss with their campers ahead of time. We spent a lot of time communicating to parents about what would be different, and we wanted to remind them, hey, tell your camper as well. Camp is not going to look exactly the same as it always does. You might see people in masks. You will see people in masks. You'll have to wash your hands more often. There will be some activities you might not be able to do. And prepping the campers for that, I think, is important, as well as with parents. I think parents need to be reassured of the safety. Kids are a lot more concerned with like what's going to be different and what's going to be what I remember from camp and what I love about camp. So I think that's an important thing. I think it's also important for us to be very clear with our summer staff about those expectations. The fluidity of the role of a summer staffer, about our programs and how those things might change. You know, these policies and procedures and the guidance we receive can change in the middle of a week, and we need to be prepared for that. Our staff need to know that that is a possibility. So we emphasized all of our policies, our expectations so much during staff training. I mentioned that we had our staff kind of brainstorm ways in which things would look differently, the safer way to do activities. Another thing I would recommend during staff training, if possible, was that we did a sort of practice day. We invited kids belonging to our permanent staff and some board members to come for a day, like a mock day of day camp, where we went through from morning to pickup what the day would look like. And I think that was really helpful for our staff to move in from the theoretical to the practical. Like, what does this actually look like at camp? What are those moments where we need to look out for, where it's difficult to distance, or when kids want to take their mask off, or how do you figure out how to do this activity in a new way? I think that was really helpful. And I think it also reassured our staff that they were able to do these policies. It can seem kind of overwhelming, I think, if you're listing all of these things that will be different this year, all of the new policies that they need to keep in mind. But I think it was actually a lot easier for our staff once they got to do it for a day and they saw it's not that big of a deal to wash hands. It's not that big of a deal to make sure that we're not touching this other group's supplies. We can follow this schedule and make sure that we never run into another group. So I think that was really helpful and really important. And I think, as a couple of folks have mentioned on this call already, just things become second nature so quickly, right? So seeing hand washing stations everywhere, bottles of hand sanitizer, you see the people cleaning up activities, you see people wearing masks, it just becomes second nature. And it is easier to follow that than you might think just when you're talking about it or setting all of these rules and expectations from the get-go. You get used to it very quickly.
Great. Thank you. Bree, David, anything? I think from my perspective, one of the things that I'm taking away from this is what seemed overwhelming last summer seems far more manageable this summer. And listening to the three of you talk about what you found successful, I think should give our participants a little confidence that it's not as daunting as it seems, and that it is certainly something we can tackle on a smaller scale, individually, each little category. Anything to add about lodging and setting expectations?
Well, I think kids are a lot easier they're a lot quicker to follow the rules that are set than some adults are, for sure. And so kids who have been in school or starting to return to school, they're going to already be dealing with some of this. So it's not going to be as foreign to them as we may think that it is. And they're a lot more resilient. They're like, oh, okay, we got to wear masks to go down to the ropes course. That's fine. I don't care. I want to go to the ropes course. So that's going to be a big piece of it. And then the other thing is, as you start, if you didn't run any program last summer and you're kind of restarting, what you're going to discover is that every answer probably breeds 2 or 3 more questions that you have to answer. And that's okay. Sometimes we get into that paralysis by analysis and we just don't know. And that's okay too. So you not only you're going to do all this work to set your protocols right now, but you're going to be changing those protocols. You're going to be working through it when you move from that theoretical to the practical, and that's okay as well. So just keep up the work, keep up the faith, and keep answering those questions, no matter how many more questions those answers bring.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Bree? Any thoughts on that?
I would say the aspects of camp that make camp why we all fell in love with going to camp and being a camper, or we enjoy being camp professionals, it's all still there. It's all still intact, even with incredible changes to your program. If you call them incredible, we don't think of them as incredible anymore. When we think of, checking in and checkout process, we think of no cohorts getting together and intermingling. It's still okay. Campers are still having relationships. They are still being impacted by camp. Even if they had to wash their hands 8 times today, it's okay. And it's okay that we are asking them to do things that may have seemed 2 years ago out of the question. It's no longer out of the question. And for us, there was such a sense of gratitude and such a sense of appreciation, even with campers, even though that seems so far above what they could comprehend, it wasn't. 9 and 10-year-olds saying to us, thank you for basically putting in all the work to make camp happen. I have friends who didn't get to go to camp this summer, but I get to go to camp because you did all this stuff. And that was powerful to us. They recognized that this is hard, but we did it so they could come to camp. And just, I hope that is a word of encouragement when you start thinking about, oh my gosh, we have to color coordinate, or we can't go close to another group, or we have to think about how to individually pack ranch dressing because we can't have a salad bar. Whatever those things are, it's worth it, because ultimately the camp experience is very much still the camp experience, even with these protocols in place. And it will be a great summer.
That's awesome news and awesome recommendation. And I agree, because it is about the kids, and the kids still reap the rewards and benefits of what you're doing. So thank you for doing it. I think from the kids' perspective, something that's probably new are any policies or procedures that you have surrounding health assessments and screenings. And I'm curious, Emily, what you're planning or thinking in regards to that this summer.
Sure. So last summer and this summer, we did and we will do daily health screenings on site. So when our day campers arrive, they stop first at the office. We took their temperature with a touchless infrared forehead thermometer, asked them a couple of questions about symptoms, exposure to anyone. If we ever had a high temp reading, we would check it again with an oral thermometer, as the infrared ones can sometimes read high depending on the temperature. And so before they even went up to where their group was, we had this checkpoint. So if there was a question of symptoms, or if they did have a high reading, we would ask them to pull over, have the nurse come down and do an oral check or a health check with them. So every day, all of our campers had that check. We also did that with all of our staff, whether they were working directly with kids or not, whether they were on support staff or as counselors. This summer, we are doing the same with day campers, with our staff, as well as our overnight campers. We're going to start every day with a health check. It's just another layer of protection. It's just one more thing we can do. We're also requiring that our overnight campers come with a negative PCR COVID test prior to arrival. We were thinking 96 hours prior. We just received best practices from our state guidance from our state that recommends 3 days prior. So we're working that out, and we're partnering with a at-home testing service that will send a kit to families, and they can send it off and the results come to us. They can also choose to go to their doctor instead, or any testing site. They need to bring proof of a negative COVID test prior to arrival.
Great. What about you, Emily, David? Thoughts on health assessments and screenings? And then once we tackle this, we'll probably talk into what are you doing if someone is found positive. So we will get there, but let's talk first about, I'd love to hear what your experience was and what you're planning for health assessments and screenings.
Yeah, I'll start. So last year I said that we required that 14-day temperature check. That was the recommendation that we got. This year we're still going to be doing it, but not feeling like it's as big a deal. I don't know that we would necessarily send a camper away if they didn't bring that form with the 14-day temperature check. We are considering an on-site test for campers who are coming. There's several companies that are doing it free of charge to camps. They're billing either the camper's insurance or they're billing the CARES Act. So we're looking into that as well. And I really like that idea of coming with a negative test, if that's a possibility for all your campers. But we continue to do health screenings every day, and it really just, the temperature is not necessarily the biggest indicator of whether or not someone is carrying or exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19, but it is a check, and it's a check that we can actually put a number on, right? It's more about, are you checking in with your camper before they come to camp every day to make sure that they're feeling well, right? And so a temperature check is an easy way to do that. And we in our letter that we told parents to do this, we said it's not just about running the thermometer over the kid's head. It's about asking if they're feeling well, if they've had a cough, and just checking into that and making sure that you're bringing healthy campers to camp, because healthy camp starts at home. And we also worked really hard with our protocols to, if someone is sick for any reason, or if a family is sick, a family member is sick for any reason, those deposits or any money that is paid can be rolled over to any camp program when that camper is feeling better. And so just not penalizing parents for or having to feel like they're being penalized if their camper gets sick or has a fever a couple days before camp is important.
And Emily, what about you? Oh, sorry.
Take it away, Bree.
I was gonna say, we were the same. We wanted to make sure that parents weren't gonna feel like, oh gosh, my kid doesn't feel great. I'm not sure it's COVID. I still want them to go to camp. I still, push them to go to camp. We made it very easy for parents to transfer funds. We said you can transfer it to 2021, anything like that. We really wanted to make it where they weren't going to be penalized for doing the right thing. And that was great. We started camp with, I think, 5 registrations this summer because they came from campers who didn't feel the best in 2020. So not penalizing parents for that. We last year did not require tests, and at this point, we are not requiring them this year. We are still encouraging, suggesting. We've not gone to the extent of saying required, you have to turn it in, but the 14-day temperature and how do you feel check before camp. And I want to speak a little bit of staff because we felt like Healthy Camp starts at home with campers. It starts during staff training with staff. And we quarantined our staff for a minimum of 2 weeks prior. That was our original plan, but we ended up quarantining on site for 7 weeks of our 11 summer. And part of that was just the state of where Tennessee was in the state. Our spiked cases drastically during the first week of staff training, and we really felt like, gosh, if these guys on site and not be out in the world and be out in the public, we just felt safer. That's what we did. It was the wanted to start camp, but it ended up being great. We had donors who stepped up and were helpful in providing fun things and T-bone steaks to grill when we couldn't go off site, and that was a way that they could help support us in time. When you had a lot of time late hires or folks who come into your, I'm going to say, safe quarantine group, anytime that happened for us, those folks needed to go to the health department immediately and get tested. Until they came back with a negative test for us, they had to wear a mask anytime they were not outdoors and 6 feet away. So they really wore a mask 24/7, except for sleeping, obviously swimming, that type of stuff, until they got that negative test. And that was for our staff because we wanted to know that our staff were safe going into summer.
Great. Sorry for calling you Emily Bree. Okay, and which actually brings us to our 9th and final topic, vaccines. I know that's so new this year. None of you were even talking or thinking about it last year. So let's open it up with Emily, and then we'll go to Bree, and then we'll go to David, and talk to me about what your thoughts are and what your plans are for handling vaccines this year and what your positions are.
Sure. So yeah, it's such a new thing, right? Like this wasn't even an idea in my head last summer. And so it's in many ways a huge relief that vaccines are more widely available. And it varies state by state. In Arkansas, where my camp is located, vaccines are available to anyone who is 16 or older. So they've opened it up to all groups now, which is wonderful. With that in mind, we are strongly encouraging all of our summer staff to get vaccinated before they come. They don't have to, we're not requiring it. Similarly, our permanent staff, our staff that's currently here, was strongly encouraged to be vaccinated. And most of us are, but not everyone chose to be vaccinated. We are asking anyone who chooses to not be vaccinated that they will not be with overnight campers this summer. They might do day camp, they might do support staff positions, but we are not putting them in cabins with campers because of the increased time they would be spending face-to-face with campers, and more unmasked time as well around eating and sleeping, all that. We also are considering asking any staff that are not vaccinated to take weekly tests to ensure that they are COVID negative. The majority of the staff that we've hired and we've reached out to have taken us up on the offer of getting vaccinated. I think the majority of our staff will be vaccinated. We also have an expectation with our staff that they know that there are risks inherent to taking any job in the current pandemic, and that they will act accordingly as members of a community. So last summer, similar to Bree, we had our entire staff, we had 2 separate staff households, but each one was what we called a quarantine. And so they were basically a family where they didn't have to distance around each other. They didn't have to wear masks indoors. They were a family unit. And as such, they had to create a covenant together where they figured out amongst themselves how they wanted to interact, what they felt comfortable with, what they didn't. Because their decisions as an individual did not just affect them, they affected the community, their staff, their quarantine. And so to that end, beyond our recommendations for avoiding crowds and wearing masks and appropriate PPE, distancing and all of that, the staff decided as a unit what they wanted to do and how they wanted to interact with the public if they needed to go grocery shopping or if they wanted to see family on weekends, things like that. We'll have a similar situation this summer, but some of it with just the added layer of protection that many of our staff or most of our staff will be vaccinated. But we are planning on having a quarantine cohort. We're not separating out those who aren't vaccinated from those who are. It will be a team unit where some, we hope as many as possible, will be vaccinated. I think some folks are hopeful that we can have campers be vaccinated before the summer as well. As far as I know, vaccines are still only approved for those who are 16 and older. And for us and for our camps, that's a very small percentage of our overnight campers. So we will encourage those campers who are eligible to be vaccinated, but we don't anticipate it being feasible for most of our campers to be vaccinated before the summer.
We're in a very similar boat. We are excited that vaccines are available, and even more excited that in Tennessee right now, anyone can get them above the age of 16, just like Emily said. And that's exciting for us. We are highly encouraging it, obviously not requiring it for any staff person, but encouraging it, but not just for our staff, but also for any volunteers. One thing we limited last summer, obviously, was the public coming in, but there were a couple of volunteer positions that are volunteer because these nice folks don't want to be paid, but really they should be staff positions, like our boat driver for water skiing and things like that. We allowed those folks to come into camp last summer. This summer, they are included in that. We really encourage you to be vaccinated as well as our staff. One thing that we are talking about, we don't think that we will be quarantining as rigid as we did last summer, which was very much locked down and only went off site in the camp van with the group together, and never stepped foot in a restaurant. We did takeout, we did all that stuff as a staff. This summer, we are looking at a much more, I'm going to say, lax kind of model. We don't believe we will be quarantining as strictly. However, vaccines make a difference, and they make a difference in the safety of your community. And so we haven't exactly decided policy yet, but we are looking at maybe some differences in what we will be okay with and not okay with for staff who are or aren't vaccinated. Maybe number of times off site, covenanting together to do certain things like wear masks anytime you're in public and social distancing and stuff like that. But that also may include things like not being allowed or really pushing to not go to large group gatherings if you are an unvaccinated person, especially. And so we haven't exactly decided what that might look like, but people who are and aren't vaccinated may be treated a little differently as to their time off site and what we are okay with. And because they do come back into that community, and how we're going to do that. And their decisions do impact not just them, but other staff members and also children. So that's where we are as far as vaccines and vaccinations, but we are highly encouraging it. It does nothing but make our community safer.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that statement. The staff's behavior offsite has always impacted the community that they come back to, but now we have a really firm example of that. And so encouraging that. Same thing with us as far as the vaccines go. The one thing that I'm communicating with any staff that I'm talking with about working at camp is if you do get vaccinated, it means that you can work the whole summer, that you're not going to possibly get sick and then have to miss 2 weeks of work, 2 weeks of this calling that you've decided to take on, and 2 weeks of ministry. So playing on that FOMO a little bit, I think, is going to help some of these staff with that. But we've also offered to do anything we can for out-of-state staff. Wisconsin is open to everybody right now, and I think that's going to be the case across the country. But explaining, and the ACA did a fantastic job kind of lobbying that camp counselors, camp staff are essential workers. They're going to be childcare for the summer. So in a lot of states, they are they're eligible for vaccines, and any letters that we need to write to help staff with that process, we're happy to do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I think that brings us to our wrap up here, because that was our last topic. So I want to thank you all for participating. And I'm just wondering if there's any parting words or advice you have that we didn't already specifically address, anything I might have missed in our little cheat sheet, little outline.
I would just say, I'm preaching to the choir here, but camp is so important for kids, and kids need camp. And especially after this year of increased screen time and time where they're not socializing with their peers or seeing as many friends or family, camp is so important for kids. Time outdoors is so important for kids. And what we are doing, we've said both of these things. It's hard, and it's not that hard. You figure it out. You make it happen, you get used to it, and it is all worth it, because camp is so important for these kids, especially now. And we are really doing a service by figuring it out for our campers and our families.
Yeah.
I would say,
go ahead, Bree.
Go ahead. I would say, the one big takeaway for us in 2020 was, one of the surprising things was how many things we loved. How many things out of all these things we were forced to think of camp in new and different ways. We were forced to be creative, because to have camp, we had to be creative. And to have camp, we had to think outside the box and think of new ways to do things. And if COVID were to disappear today, right now, at this very second, there are so many of those things that we were forced to do differently that worked so well, that our campers liked, that our parents liked, that we enjoyed, that we would keep and we will keep. But we were pleasantly surprised that even after all that work and thinking and feeling so overwhelmed, that after we put these things in practice, they ended up being things we're going to keep, even if COVID disappeared right now. And so I would say, as overwhelming as you may be feeling at this very second, get excited about some new and different ways to think of things that you may decide, man, we should have been doing this all along, and this actually works out better and is a better product for our guests and for our parents and customers. It's okay, and you may just like it.
Awesome. My parting piece of advice is, an emergency is not the time to learn your job. You don't sit down and write your fire protocols after something is on fire. So take this time right now to think about that. One of our board members said last summer, if we open camp, we are going to have COVID on our site at some point during the summer. And luckily we got through the summer. We had no positive tests. We had no campers who were sick, but we had our protocols for, if there is someone who's symptomatic, what do we do? How do we get them home? How do we keep them isolated? And that's a very emotional time. So my parting suggestion would be to sit down and write that letter or that email that you're going to have to send to all the campers who are on site. If you had a positive test on site or a confirmed case, sit down and write that right now, when you're not emotional and you're not in the midst of it. You can edit it later, but at least get that there so that you are prepared for those scenarios when and if they come up. And we, of course, pray that they don't. But be prepared and write that down now, and do it when you're not emotional and you're not tired from running summer camp and not pulling your hair out because of all the trials and tribulations of that. So that would be my last little bit of advice.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Emily. Thank you, Bree. I really do appreciate that you're willing to share your wisdom from people who have walked the walk. For the people who are listening and just overwhelmed at what lies before them, I think you've broken everything down in ways that people will leave here believing it's doable, it's manageable. And for the people who are listening, please go to the CDC website, go to the American Camp Association, access their field guide, and go forth and do great things. Thank you, everyone.